Okay, my lecture today is titled From Propaganda to Fake News, Deception, Manipulation and Truth in the Contemporary Media Environment. Now, today in the world that we live in the society that we live in, we have a major and dominating debate regarding fake news and the manipulation of information. This is something which is continually being debated by politicians, continually being debated by media pundits, and there's a very high degree of awareness amongst publics and people, certainly throughout the West, that there is a substantial debate over fake news and the manipulation of information. This has become a buzzword. It's become something which has, to a large extent, dominated a large amount of political conversation at this point in time. Now, I'm going to be talking about fake news, but straight away at the start of this lecture, I really want to sort of dispel or to challenge these terms straight away, which will allow me to then get on to really my focus, which is on the question of propaganda. And I want to sort of question and dispel this fake news issue by saying that fake news really, at the end of the day, what we are talking about when we say fake news, we are really talking about propaganda. That when we talk about a post-fact world, a world of post-truth and so on, we are really talking about a highly propagandized information environment. So, really another way of putting this, I'm asking people to think, when they hear the word fake news, when they hear the words post-fact world, that they just remind themselves that what we're really talking about here is propaganda at the end of the day. So a challenge to the buzzwords in circulation and a suggestion that we should perhaps use terms which are more accurate and which are more consistent with our, in a sense, historical understanding of manipulated information environments. So I don't call it fake news, call it propaganda. Straight off, I'm going to start by offering or making a suggestion of a definition of propaganda, and as I segue through this talk, I will give more and more detail as we progressively go through in order to give you a sense of what propaganda is, how it works, where it emanates from. But I'm going to start now by offering a reasonably clear definition of what it is. Propaganda is a coordinated approach to influencing beliefs and conduct. Okay? Principally, propaganda is not a consensual two-way process. Propaganda does not involve a balanced, reasoned conversation between two people trying to understand or trying to work out what they think the truth is. Propaganda is about a one-way, non-consensual process in which people are, in some shape or form, being manipulated into thinking or behaving in a particular way. So it's a manipulative form of persuasion, that is what propaganda is, and it's a manipulative form of persuasion which violates rational or free will. Now, I could divert for a second that there are a few academics who like to think of propaganda as being applicable to any form of persuasion, even two-way consensual persuasion, but that's not really the way the term has been used over the last 100 years, and I think doesn't really capture the general understanding of what propaganda is, and so on. So the definition I'm going with is that propaganda involves some kind of manipulation, some kind of a violation of the rational or free will. Now, I want to flag up straight away, deception is often understood or propaganda is often seen as synonymous with deception. And it is certainly the case that deception and manipulation of information which becomes deceptive is a key part of propaganda and the way propaganda works. But it's not the only mechanism by which propaganda works. Propaganda doesn't necessarily mean telling straight lies, for example, and it doesn't necessarily mean telling half-truths or exaggerating information. It can also involve other processes which are essentially non-consensual, and I'll flag these up later in the lecture, which get people to think in a particular way or get people to act in a particular way. So there, a definition of propaganda to start us off. Now, of course, when we think of propaganda, or going back to the term which I've asked everyone not to use, fake news, when we think of propaganda, what comes to mind are these kind of things, these kind of political actors. So in the top left-hand corner, you've got Donald Trump, Nigel Farage in the top right-hand corner, lurking behind Putin, and then you got RT, Russia Today, and InfoWars at the bottom. These are the kind of things which come to mind when people think of propaganda in the current debate over fake news. I think Donald Trump, various questions raised about his claims regarding the turnout at his inaugural lecture, his inauguration. Questions raised about his claims regarding a terrorist attack in Sweden, and questions surrounding his claims regarding climate change, which many people argue are essentially deceptions or manipulations. They're propagandistic, they're fake news. Nigel Farage and UKIP, in terms of the Brexit campaign, has come in for widespread criticism for manipulating and exaggerating the negative consequences of the European Union. And a lot of people, I think, would comfortably say what you get from Nigel Farage is fake news or propaganda. The big one, the big issue in some ways at the moment relates to Putin and relates to Russia, and this is a dominating debate within the US, of course, since the US election with the Russiagate scandal and so on. But in many ways, many people believe, and I would argue inaccurately or incorrectly, believe that Putin and Russia are, in a very significant way, manipulating the opinions and the minds of people in the West through clever and covert propaganda, through social media, through Russia Today and so on. And some people in America, and some people certainly in Europe, are even pushing this argument further and suggesting that in a sense, Putin is almost influencing Trump and Nigel Farage and so on, and this kind of claims of Trump being Putin's puppet and so on have circulated. And so, in terms of sort of this array of actors who we commonly understand as being responsible for fake news and propaganda, some people are even arguing that the Russians are all behind it, that Putin's behind it. In terms of media outlets, I mean, Russia Today is regularly in the news and being criticised for being a propaganda agent for Putin and for Russia. And in the bottom left-hand corner is Alex Jones from InfoWars. And I need to just check on libel issues, perhaps. But Alex Jones in InfoWars is regularly accused of disseminating untruthful information, disseminating lies and so on, that it's a pure propaganda channel. So, these are the things which come to mind when we think of propaganda. But of course, we're also subjected to propaganda, or we're also subjected to attempts to manipulate our minds, our beliefs and our behaviours from what people would understand to be legitimate or mainstream media sources and political actors. Okay, so I've thrown up a couple of examples here. In the top left-hand corner, you've got an image which I should probably explain, just for those of you who might not be familiar with it. In the top left-hand corner, you have an image of George Bush. This is shortly after the invasion of Iraq, after the Iraqi regime had been toppled. And you have George Bush having landed Top Gun style aboard a US aircraft carrier, declaring to the American public and declaring to the world that the mission had been accomplished in Iraq. And the actual image on the aircraft carrier, mission accomplished, the banner, that was actually imposed over that. It wasn't actually there. Now this, as we know now, in terms of the purposes of this PR stunt, is one way of putting it, was to essentially send a message to the American public that the war was over in Iraq. And perhaps I have to say this, the war in Iraq still continues to this day. The war was never really over at the point at which they were declaring mission accomplished. But it was designed to try and persuade people that the war was over. But it was also designed to send a powerful message to the Iraqi people that they had been defeated, that they should bow down and accept what had happened to their country. So it was a propaganda message. It was trying to manipulate how people were thinking, acting and believing in relation to the invasion of Iraq, and trying, as they were, the imperative of this media campaign, or this image, was to try and get the American public to move on from Iraq because it's been accomplished, and perhaps not pay any attention to what was actually going on in the country in terms of the rapidly emerging and civil war stroke attacks on coalition forces. Bottom right-hand corner, away from the political sphere, we've got an example of advertising propaganda. This many of you will be unfamiliar with this kind of advertising because this kind of advertising is actually banned in Britain now. But this is actually an advertising campaign for Marlboro cigarettes from Berlin from several years ago. And here you have clearly associating love, romance, and so on with cigarette smoking. Now, and there's no dispute, and no one in this room would disagree, that smoking is harmful and very harmful to the health and so on. But this advertising campaign is trying to persuade people to think that it's cool, it's associated with benign, positive things such as falling in love. And the overall campaign was called Don't Be a Maybe, Be a Marlboro, Maybe Never Fell in Love. And so it's suggesting, it's associating cigarette smoking with being daring and so on. This is all, in one sense, very inaccurate and misleading. And obviously this campaign, actually, coming from Marlboro in Berlin, was targeting the younger generation. It wasn't targeting sort of older established smokers. It was targeting young people and so on. It's an attempt to manipulate our feelings. It's an attempt to try to get us to want to smoke cigarettes because we associate it with benign, positive things in life, such as love, and we forget about the potentially harmful and very harmful effects of cigarette smoking. It's propaganda. Now, so again, just to reiterate, commonly people think of propaganda and they think of these kind of illegitimate political actors and so on, or heavily criticized political actors, or the enemy, the Russians and so on. And people associate these images or these entities with propaganda. But in fact, propaganda is commonly seen coming from legitimate political actors. President Bush, coming from the mainstream, so to speak, Marlboro cigarette advertising. Now, you could be forgiven or some people might argue that really this is all quite mild forms of propaganda. This isn't such a big deal, that it's not as bad as the propaganda that you have emanating from Nigel Farage or from Putin or from Donald Trump. But I'm going to show a clip in a second, and this is just to make the point that we're not just subjected to what some people might suggest are mild forms of propaganda, but we're also subjected to much more severe forms of propaganda. And what I'm going to show you is a video clip, and it goes back to Gulf War I, and it's a video clip of a young girl who gave testimony to the US Congress with regard to what she had seen going on in Kuwait following the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. So I'll just play this clip and let you listen to it. I apologise now, it's quite difficult to listen to this clip because it's very traumatising what the girl is saying, and she's clearly very, very upset and so on. So I'll just show this clip and then I'll return to talking about it.
Thank you very much. Our final witness is also using an assumed name, and again we ask our friends in the media to respect the need for her to protect her family. And we finally call on Naira to testify.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, my name is Naira, and I just came out of Kuwait. My mother and I were in Kuwait on August 2nd for a peaceful summer holiday. My older sister had a baby on July 29th. And we wanted to spend some time in Kuwait with her. I only pray that none of my 10th grade classmates had a summer vacation like I did. I may have wished sometime that I could be an adult, that I could grow up quickly. What I saw happen to the children of Kuwait and to my country has changed my life forever. It has changed the life of all Kuwaitis, young and old. We are children no more. My sister, with my 5-day-old nephew, traveled across the desert to safety. There was no milk available for the baby in Kuwait. They barely escaped when their car was stuck in the desert sand, and help came from Saudi Arabia. I stayed behind and wanted to do something for my country. The second week after an invasion, I volunteered at the Al-Adan hospital with 12 other women who wanted to help as well. I was the youngest volunteer. The other women were from 20 to 30 years old. While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators, took the incubators, and left the children to die on the cold floor. It was horrifying. I could not help but think of my nephew, who, if born premature, might have died that day as well.
Okay, I will stop recording there. Testimony from a young girl to the US Congress in the run-up to the war, Operation Desert Storm, to liberate Kuwait from the Iraqi invasion. And that testimony was given by the girl to the US Congress, claiming that Iraqi soldiers had removed children, babies from incubators, premature children, and allowed them to die on the floor of the hospital. That claim was entirely false. It was a fabrication. In reality, the girl who you see there giving testimony to the US Congress, she was actually the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to the United States. That event that you saw there was organised by the Citizens for a Free Kuwait. It was part of their public relations campaign, and Hill & Knowlton, the PR firm working for the Kuwaiti government, had trained, advised and coached that young girl to tell that story in front of the US Congress. It was a straightforward, egregious lie, deception over what had been going on in Iraq. Clearly, with the overall motivation designed to build the moral support, build the constituency to support military operations to expel Iraq from Kuwait. It was not, in a sense, a mild form of propaganda, which some might suggest that these are. It was a severe form of propaganda in the sense of the level of deception involved. But this circulated, this went out onto mainstream media. This is at the time people were reading the Washington Post, the New York Times, and reading these stories and being horrified and feeling that, yes, we have to do something. We have to sort of back the military operation in order to expel Iraq from Kuwait. It was war propaganda. Now, it's worth saying for a second that none of in what I'm saying necessarily means that what you've just seen can be argued to be wrong, because some people might argue that that kind of propaganda is a kind of necessary propaganda that you have to engage in order to achieve good outcomes and so on. So this is not necessarily making a normative judgment on it, but what it is saying is that people in Western publics are, and the question of the degree to which that is the case is an empirical one, and I'll return to this as we go through later parts of the lecture, but the degree to which, we are subjected to these very severe forms of propaganda, which are essentially outright lies, and so on. So it may well be the case that these are the baddies in the game in terms of lots of bad propaganda, and I'm not saying that they are, but it might be that's the case. But it simply isn't the case that we're entirely free from that in Western democracies, and we are subjected to fairly profound deceptions, as you see with the Kuwaiti ambassador's daughter giving testimony to the US Congress, having been coached by a PR firm in order to tell lies in order to enable military action. So we are surrounded by propaganda. We're surrounded by propaganda from the illegitimate political sources and illegitimate media such as RT, and we're also surrounded by propaganda coming from legitimate, in a sense, political sources and coming through, as it were, legitimate mainstream media. Now, this is the point in these talks which I always sort of try to take back and take a historical perspective on this, because this idea that we are surrounded by propaganda, in fact, although we feel that most people, when they think of the word propaganda, they're not thinking of the mainstream media, they're not thinking of Western politicians and so on. It is in fact the case, if you go back 100 years, if you go back to the first part of the 20th century, you'll find that the discussion about propaganda amongst intellectuals, amongst politicians, amongst academics was quite widespread. And the point I'm getting to here is that really propaganda was once upon a time understood as a necessary component of government, a necessary component of democratic government. And here you have here's an image of Edward Bernays. Edward Bernays was the nephew of Freud. As I'm sure you're all aware, Freud, an expert on working out how people tick. And Eddie Bernays drew upon some of Freud's work in order to inform his understanding and inform his proposals and suggestions regarding propaganda. And Eddie Bernays, and as you can see in a quote there, Eddie Bernays saw propaganda as a necessary part of liberal democracies. He says that the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organised habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. And Eddie Bernays was not the only intellectual saying those kind of things in the first part of the 20th century. Harold Lasswell, a political scientist, also wrote and discussed propaganda and the way in which democracies needed to use propaganda in order to function correctly. Walter Lippmann, journalist, intellectual commentator, also wrote about the necessities of propaganda in the first part of the 20th century. And I wanted to now, just certainly because of the context of my talk later on, when I start getting onto the Chilcot report and I get onto the war on terror, is to give a little bit of an insight into the kind of reasons why people in power, political elites, governments and so on, have come to believe that propaganda is a necessary part of democracy. And here's the example I've got here, or the person I want to talk about is John Mearsheimer. And John Mearsheimer gives some very powerful insights into the rationale that underpins the belief in the necessity for propaganda and deception. And John Mearsheimer in 2010 wrote the book Why Leaders Lie. And he's a high-profile American international relations scholar. He's a realist. But he also has a certain honesty about the way he talks about what is going on in the world and the way he talks about international politics. And he argues that deception and the propaganda that goes along with deception is a necessary part of pursuing strategic objectives that serve the national interest. And he argues that he makes a wonderfully counterintuitive point that actually in the international system, states rarely lie to each other, principally because they have intelligence services who can work that out and find out the truth of what's going on. But he says that states much more frequently will lie to their own populations, and they will lie to their own populations in order to ensure that they can pursue these broader strategic objectives. And this is why I'm going to say something so probably be more controversial for some people. He argues that liberal democracies regularly deceive their publics when the behaviour of that liberal democracy contravenes its claims and aspirations to being moral, law-abiding and upstanding. Democracies frequently lie to their populations when they're having to do something in the international system for strategic, realpolitik reasons, and then they have to sugarcoat it and present it in a particular way to their publics in order to make sure the public support what they're doing. And I've given these talks sometimes in settings where talking with people in foreign policy establishment, and you sometimes hear them say that sort of we know what needs to be done, we need to carry the public with us, but that means not telling them the whole truth, or it means engaging in some kind of propaganda. And this sort of goes through to the last point, is, this is a kind of elitist underpinning to this rationale which supports the use of propaganda, and it's a rationale that foreign policy elites are best placed to decide foreign policy in the international system, that foreign policy elites really know what needs to be done, and so on. So that's part of the rationale. There's also, that's a kind of a practical sort of political position on the need for deception and propaganda in at least international politics. It's all about serving the national interest, ultimately pursuing strategic objectives which might be uncomfortable for a lot of people within your country to sign up to and to accept. But there's also a broader ideological underpinning, I think, to the use of propaganda. And here you have, this is one of those slides which I always feel I have to show. Sometimes I feel I should ditch it, but sometimes I feel I really need to show this slide because it's just too good not to show. But this is a quote from Irving Kristol, who's a neoconservative, and he makes this wonderful set of assertions. He says that there are truths appropriate for children, truths that are appropriate for students, those that are appropriate for educated adults, highly educated, and so on. And then he says that the notion that there should be one set of truths for everyone is a fallacy of modern-day democracy. It simply does not work. And what he's getting at here ultimately is Plato's noble lie, for those of you who might be familiar with Plato. Plato's noble lie was essentially, and I'm a bit rusty on the details, but Plato's noble lie is essentially this idea that society is made up of different classes and different strata, and in order for that society to function and keep working without breaking down into a state of disorder, you need to tell lies, you need to tell stories at least, about why people occupy the position they do in society. So Plato talked about, I think, the golden people, the bronze people, and so on, about these different classes, different strata in society, and the necessity of telling stories, i.e. propaganda, lies, deception, but telling stories to help people make sense of where they are in the world. And this is really sort of where Irving Kristol is, although he's not very explicit about it, is harking back to, is this notion of Plato's noble lie, that societies are made of multiple strands, and in order to get people to cohere, or for society to be cohesive, you need to engage in this storytelling about why people occupy particular parts of particular strata within the society. So there's an ideological underpinning to this notion broadly of storytelling, narratives, and broadly this issue of propaganda and deception in society. And just to make the point really clear, I mean, what I'm trying to get at here is that, that there is an established historical intellectual tradition talking about the use of propaganda in democracies, and there's a rationale for it as well. I'm not saying whether that rationale is right or wrong, I'm just saying that's what the rationale is for people who are proponents of the use of propaganda. Now, going back to this idea, and when I was showing you the images of Bush and showing you the images of Trump, I was suggesting that we don't really see these things of propaganda coming from legitimate media, that we've had this kind of historical knowledge that propaganda was being discussed and used and advocated. That's been sort of, as it were, taken out of our minds. And there are reasons for this, and there are very concrete, directed reasons why we don't think that we live in a world where there is a lot of propaganda and where we might be being propagandized. And here is one of the reasons. Edward Bernays said that propaganda got to be a bad word because of the Germans using it during World War I. And he said, so what I did, or what we did, was to find some other form of words. So we found the words council and public relations. And there was born PR, public relations. Okay, this is where the term public relations come from. I sometimes give these talks to people. I sometimes give talks to people from the PR Academy and so on, academics who work in public relations, etc. And some of them are quite shocked to find out that their subject area was historically, traditionally called propaganda, and so on. But this is where PR comes from. It was a way to try and rebrand propaganda. And as the late Phil Taylor, war media historian, articulated, over time, since sort of Eddie Bernays' first foray into trying to rebrand propaganda, we have since then a euphemism industry, as Phil Taylor, who, for me to clarify, he was a professor of war and media, he's passed away now, but he spent most of his academic career advising the US military, etc., on various PR/propaganda strategies. But he argues that there's been a euphemism industry, and we have a whole array of terms: political marketing. I won't read through all of them, but political marketing, promotional culture, public diplomacy, perception management, political communication. The list goes on and on and on. And he says that these are all terms which are used within liberal democracies, essentially to disguise the fact that propaganda is being engaged in, and so on. This is a euphemism industry. Again, part of the process of erasing from our minds an awareness that we might be being subject to manipulation and propaganda. So what this all means, and perhaps I'm being too easy on the audience here, but I want to make the point as clear as possible. The net result of all of this, the net result of Eddie Bernays rebranding the euphemism industry and so on, the net result of all of this is that when we think of propaganda, we think of this. We think of wartime propaganda, we think of Nazi propaganda on the left there, and for those of you whose German is not up to scratch, Bolshevism without the mask, bit of Nazi propaganda from World War II. On the right, destroy this mad brute, a bit of enlisting propaganda in the US during World War I. We think of this when we think of propaganda, and we don't think of this. We're aware that this might be manipulative, but we're not aware that this can also be, is also essentially propagandistic or manipulative, and so on. So we've had erased, or not erased is perhaps a too harsh a way of putting it, but we've had removed from our consciousness and removed from our mind the awareness that we do live in a highly propagandized environment. The question of how propagandized it is and how bad the problem is something which is going to occupy the latter part of my talk, especially when I start talking about the war on terror and so on. But now just to turn just for a few minutes to providing a little bit of analytical detail, developing perhaps a bit further the definition which I offered at the start of the talk. Propaganda techniques. You've got 6 strategies that are identified there in terms of how propaganda is executed or works. The one at the top line, I mean, many people associate propaganda with lying. That's what often comes to mind, that people are being told barefaced lies, that the notion of Nazi propaganda and the big lie, etc. Now, lying, as the German proverb suggests, is that lies have short legs. It's not a terribly efficient way of propagandizing people. The political costs associated with lies, i.e. when you make a factual statement which you know to be untrue in order to mislead people, if you get caught out in that lie, the political costs, for example, are normally fatal. You normally have to resign. So lying really, and it doesn't tend to be very effective because you tend to get found out. And so some academics, although not all agree with me, but many academics argue that lying is really the most inefficient form of propaganda. And much more frequently you have processes of distortion of information, omission of information, misdirection. And these are more subtle forms of deception. It doesn't involve barefaced lying. It doesn't involve making a factual statement. You claim something to be a fact which you know is not a fact in order to mislead. It doesn't involve that. But it means, for example, with distortion of information, exaggeration, sort of making, over-egging your case, etc. And the example I've got up there is the, and we'll look at this slightly later in the lecture, the example of Iraqi WMD capability in the run-up to the 2003 Iraq invasion. And there was an exaggeration of the intelligence evidence in order to create a sense of a much more serious, significant threat from Iraq than there actually was. Exaggeration of information rather than telling lies. Omission of information, being economical with the truth, is another part of propaganda deception strategies. And it involves omitting information, not telling a lie. You tell half the truth, but the bit you miss out is fundamental and leads to somebody being misled about a particular issue. Being economical with the truth, the phrase coming from the Scott Inquiry, which I don't have time to talk about now. Misdirection is another big one. That a lot of propaganda activities can involve trying to direct people to focus on another issue. So, in a sense, it gets you out of any kind of exaggeration, omission, or lying. But it's all about pushing people to think about one thing rather than another. And the example I put up there is the example of Russiagate. At the moment, again, some of you might sort of not quite understand what I'm talking about, but the entire political drive to associate Trump with Putin and Russia and so on, which is very much unevidenced and unsubstantiated, looks very much like a misdirection campaign. It's a way of trying to push attention onto Russia, push attention onto Trump's relationship with Russia and so on, in order to pull attention away from other domestic issues, etc. But misdirection is a big propaganda, a big part of propaganda activities. Incentivization and coercion. This is where, in a sense, this is an area which a lot of propaganda academics or people who look critically at these kind of persuasion campaigns don't tend to focus on. But it's a very important point that propaganda is not just this manipulation of information. It also involves action in the real world, and it also involves a kind of materiality. So you have this process of incentivization, for example, promising tax cuts. Where you're getting people to vote for you, not because you're persuading them to vote for you, in the sense of getting people to agree with your policies. You're actually offering them money, a tax cut, in order to come in and vote for you. And that's essentially a non-consensual process, yeah? That you're not really, somebody is voting for you not because they believe in you, but because they've been incentivized to vote for you. It's a non-consensual process. And what you'll find is that a lot of propaganda activities do involve these kind of processes of incentivization. Coercion, the most sort of severe form of propaganda, is also a key strategy which is employed. Now, coercion can take many forms in terms of propaganda campaigns, but the example I've got there is the one of surrender leaflets. And when you have military operations, for example, in Afghanistan or Iraq, and you have the dropping of leaflets, etc., these leaflets are basically saying surrender or you'll be killed. Okay, these are seen as propaganda or psychological operations leaflets. Okay, which are distributed under these circumstances. But they are essentially communicating threats. It's a coercive. The meaning or the propaganda meaning of those surrender leaflets is essentially underpinned by the credible presence of military force within that country and so on. It's essentially a coercive propaganda strategy. And so the point here is that really sort of propaganda techniques run the whole gamut from sort of lying through to manipulation of information through to actually trying to shape material context through incentivization, and actually also involve coercive, threatening communication strategies, something which is ignored by a lot of the literature at this point in time. How and where is it produced and disseminated? Written, spoken, visual is what we normally associate with propaganda campaigns, PR campaigns, as I was alluding to in the previous slide. But propaganda is also emanates from academia, from journalism and think tanks. That part of propaganda processes can be located in the context of the sites of production of knowledge. And this is a point that I'm going to return to slightly later on in the lecture, because it might not be sort of immediately obvious exactly what I'm getting at there and so on, but I will make it clearer hopefully by the end of the lecture. But the idea here is that propaganda doesn't just come from PR campaigns, it also emanates from academia, journalism, think tanks and so on, and it can be seen as part of this kind of the organisation of the production of knowledge in order to get people to believe particular things or to act in particular ways. And propaganda also, and this is sort of going back to that kind of coercive incentivization categories that I talked about in the last slide, but propaganda can also involve action in the real world, propaganda of the deed. An example I've got there is the example of shock and awe, and shock and awe was a strategy employed at the start of the Iraq invasion in 2003 with these high-profile bombing of government buildings in Baghdad. And the purpose of those bombings, there's nobody in the buildings, was to sort of send a powerful shock and awe message to the Iraqi people that they should bow down and not resist the invading forces. That was an act of propaganda. The bombing of those government buildings was all about sending a message. It was a psyops operation, all about sending a message to shape the beliefs and the behaviour of the Iraqi population. So, important point, propaganda, not just written, spoken, visual communication, not just production of knowledge through institutions such as academia, journalism and think tanks, but also involving action in the real world, propaganda of the deed. Okay, now I've been going on for quite some time now about propaganda and obviously making the point that we have propaganda here as well as them having propaganda over there in Russia, or propaganda being something that we remember or we can point to in the Second World War, First World War, etc. And I'm suggesting that we are surrounded by propaganda, and the legitimate question and the necessary question, which you should perhaps all be asking of me now, is, well, how big really is this problem? How big are the deceptions occurring in the society, in Western liberal democratic societies that we live in? And how pervasive is this propaganda? Is this something which is really just an occasional occurrence, that it's minor and trivial, and so on, as some of you might be suspecting by the end of my lecture, or is it something which is a problem of major proportions? So that's the question. How bad is this? How bad are these things that I've been talking about in liberal democracies? Now, what I'm going to do now in the final part of the talk, or the latter part of this talk, is to try to offer an interjection into that question by talking through what has been my research area for about 4 or 5 years now, in order to give you a sense of the reasons why I think we have a huge problem with propaganda and deception in Western democracies. And really, my research area has been dominated by Iraq for a long time, but really over the last 5 or 6 years has been very much concerned about the war on terror, the post 9/11 war on terror. And it's important, if we are to get an answer to this question of, well, how bad are these propaganda activities, we need to understand how serious the issue is that we're talking about. So we're talking about, is the war on terror highly propagandized and so on? Is propaganda a big issue in Western democracies? We need to have a grasp on how serious the war on terror is. And I actually do feel the need to reiterate some of these things, because it strikes me that in the contemporary information environment there's an awful lot of forgetting of what's going on in the world, and there's an awful lot of forgetting of what the West has been involved in the last 16 years. So I'm going to reiterate, make some points to just hopefully establish in your minds why the war on terror is so significant. The war on terror is so significant because since 9/11, and it's worth just interjecting there and saying that the actual war on terror, the first war on terror, was started in the late 1970s. But for us, for all of us today, in our minds, really the war on terror appears to have started at the point of 9/11. But it's extremely important because it has led to multiple wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, and now as time goes on it's becoming ever more clear that there is linkage with the wars in Libya, Syria and Yemen, which are currently going on at the moment. Not to say that Afghanistan and Iraq and Pakistan have ended, there's still ongoing conflicts in those countries. So the war on terror is important because it's led to multiple wars which the West is involved in some shape or form. These wars have led to the loss of millions of lives, and these aren't disputed facts in the sense that a number of studies from different sources have established that this is the kind of death toll that we are talking about in the context of the war on terror. Millions of people have been killed, many more lives have been disrupted and so on because of it. So it's led to wars. The war on terror is very, very important also because it's led to curtailment of civil liberties throughout the West. We're in a situation where the American government, for example, has now carried out extrajudicial killings of its own citizens through drone strikes. Okay, we have a situation where there's been profound pulling back in terms of legal processes. You can be arrested, etc., and held for long periods and so on under the Counter-Terrorism Acts. It's also led, in terms of, and again this is a civil liberties issue, it's led to the rise of surveillance society. We are today in a society where all of our electronic communications, internet, mobile phones, are potentially subject to interrogation by the intelligence services and by our governments. Okay? That's a profound, and that's an absolutely profound shift in the nature of the societies, of the democratic societies we live in. Some would suggest it's actually indicative of the end of democracy in Western democracies. But these are big, major developments which have emerged because of the war on terror. The war on terror has not only led to multiple wars in the international system and massive loss of life, it has also led to profound changes to the societies that we live in. And it might seem that it's in the background sometimes and so on, because we're caught up with, I don't know, the latest sort of tweet that Trump has put out and so on. But that is the reality of the situation we're in. The war on terror has had a very profound, significant effect globally and on Western publics. So it's very, very important. Now let's look into the questions surrounding propaganda in the war on terror to try and help sort of then take us through the next stage of the argument to then evaluate how big a problem we think there is in relation to propaganda. The Chilcot report into the 2003 Iraq War. A lot of my work in the last 5-6 years has focused on analysing information which has been emerging partly as a consequence of the Chilcot report. That came out in 2016, and there's a picture there of Sir John himself. And the inquiry was set up in order to explore the origins of the Iraq War as well as the aftermath of the Iraq War. And the Chilcot report has told us some very, very important things about the nature of the war on terror, and it's told us some very, very important things about the nature of the propaganda activities which have surrounded the war on terror. Okay. Now I'm going to break this into sort of two areas of discussion. The first area will be quite brief, and then I'll go into a slightly more extended discussion with regard to the second area. But the first thing, and I'm sort of drawing upon Donald Rumsfeld's known knowns for those of you who are familiar with that. But Donald Rumsfeld's known knowns. There's a known deception in relation to Iraq, which is confirmed by Chilcot, and that is essentially that the WMD, the weapons of mass destruction allegations which were emanating from the British and American governments in the run-up to the Iraq War were essentially propagandistic. Blair, as Chilcot said himself to the BBC, was not being straight with the British public, that there had been a process on both sides of the Atlantic of the cherry-picking and manipulation of intelligence. And for those of you who want to look at the details, and they can look at some of my recent publications, but they were cherry-picking and manipulating intelligence in order to present a misleading impression of the threat posed by Iraqi WMD. And perhaps most famously, perhaps most notoriously, this end culminated in the 45 minutes from attack claim. Just got some images there. The September dossier, which was the notorious dossier published in 2002, Tony Blair's quote there saying, at the forward of that dossier saying, "What I believe the assessed intelligence has established beyond doubt is that Saddam has continued to produce chemical and biological weapons," leading through to these kind of headlines that Britain was 45 minutes from doom. This was all a gross exaggeration of the intelligence that was available. These kind of claims, the 45 minutes claims, the claims that Iraq was actively producing WMD, were the end point of a process which went on for many, many, many months, with many people working on the dossiers, intelligence people involved, and essentially moving everything in one direction. And the direction it was being moved in was to present Iraq was a threat, when actually the intelligence suggested, in terms of an objective reading of it, suggested that most Iraq might become a threat 5 years down the line after sanctions had been lifted. But it was cherry-picked massage in order to create the impression that Iraq was an immediate threat. And that's a known deception in the sense that it's confirmed now. Okay. What I'm interested in, and what I'm going to finish talking, where I will move into the closing sections of this talk, I want to focus on, is the unknown deception. And now, the Chilcot report confirmed the 45 minutes. But in many ways, the Chilcot report gave insights into what is an unknown deception, something we don't know about. We all know about WMD and exaggeration in Iraq, but what we don't know is really some of the issues surrounding the origins of the war on terror after 9/11. And so I refer to this as an unknown deception. Whether it's an unknown or an unknown known is another matter, and for those of you who are fans of Donald Rumsfeld, you can spend time working out which of those two categories you'd put it into. But the really interesting part of the Chilcot report, the really important part of the Chilcot report, which was actually missed by a lot of journalists and hasn't really been spoken about since the report was published, was what it told us about the formative stages of the war on terror and the documents that the Chilcot report released regarding conversations going on between Blair and Bush during the weeks immediately after 9/11. And this material, as I've argued in recent publications, is of absolutely pivotal importance regarding to our understanding of the war on terror and our understanding of, as it were, how bad the propaganda associated with it has been. So what am I getting at here? You're probably wondering, and I'm conscious of energy and so on of everybody, but not of talking too long. What am I talking about here? Well, this is the information which emerges from Chilcot's section 3.1, which is extremely important for understanding the war on terror and understanding the extent of propaganda. Approximately 1 week after 9/11, Chilcot released this excerpt from a British embassy cable from Washington, saying that the regime change hawks in Washington were arguing that a coalition put together for one purpose, fighting terrorism, could be used to clear up other problems in the region. Okay, so immediately you have here in the Chilcot report an indication that on the American side, okay, the kind of rationale which was being thought through immediately after 9/11 was not so much necessarily about tackling Al-Qaeda or Islamic fundamentalism. It was about taking advantage of that in order to then pursue a geostrategic strategy, unclear at the moment, just clearing up other problems in a region, and I'll get to the details shortly. But it's an immediate indication that the war on terror is was not and is not exactly of the form that is always publicly claimed. It's about fighting Al-Qaeda, fighting Islamic fundamentalism. By December of 2001, a couple of months after 9/11, you have documents going back and forth between Bush and Blair talking about phases 1 and 2 of the war on terror. And in one of these documents you have 7 countries identified, and the countries identified are Iraq, Philippines, Syria, Iran, Yemen, Somalia and Indonesia. A list of countries which are identified for various sorts of reaction operations and so on. So you have a major military, potentially a major military campaign, which appears to be being planned, coming from the documents released by Chilcot. There's an interesting little nugget here. It's not a nugget. This is an example of a document from Tony Blair to George Bush, where he's talking about how they might remove Saddam Hussein from power. And I want to emphasize this is immediately after 9/11. This is after all the focus on Al-Qaeda and Islamic fundamentalist terrorism. You've got Tony Blair discussing with George Bush ways of going about removing Saddam Hussein from power. And so Tony Blair talks about we can start by supporting opposition groups, we can move to covert operations, when rebellions finally occur, we can back them militarily. This here, and there's no other way of describing it, is a British Prime Minister and American President plotting to overthrow the government of another country, plotting this phase, plotting to try to do it in a way which doesn't require a full-blown invasion, which is what they ended up having to do. But it gives you a very powerful insight into the kind of thought processes which were going on immediately after 9/11. They were looking to overthrow Saddam Hussein straight away, as soon as 9/11 had occurred. Here's a document referring to Syria and Iran, and Tony Blair says, if toppling Saddam is your prime objective, it's far easier to do it with Syria and Iran in favour or acquiescing rather than hitting all 3 at once. This is very damning. This is clearly indicating that the conversation going on between Bush and Blair is one of when do we hit these countries? When do we engage in military action? And this is Syria and Iran, and these are countries entirely unassociated with the kind of Salafist, Wahhabist terrorism which was being associated or alleged to be associated with 9/11. Again, 2 leaders of 2 democracies plotting to attack other countries. Obviously, with this emerging sort of set of regime change operations, which you see being discussed in some of these documents, you also have discussion over the propaganda campaign, which is going to be necessary. And here you have, this is Tony Blair here talking in the lower part of the slide. He's saying that there are all sorts of, he says, find myself, yes, we need a dedicated, tightly knit propaganda unit for the war generally and for the Arab and Muslim war in particular. So he's talking about if we're going to engage in this kind of level of military action, we need a propaganda campaign to underpin it. And it's worth just reiterating, if there's a euphemism industry out there, and we all call these things strategic communication, and politicians say, we don't do propaganda, we tell you the truth. In private, they use the word. They're comfortable to use the word propaganda. This is very interesting. This is a document, and actually forgive me because I can't quite remember who it came from. I think it's one of Blair's closest aides talking about the necessary propaganda campaign in relation to phases 1 and 2 of the war on terror, that list of countries. And you have Tony Blair talking about, or so one of his officials talking about propaganda, communication strategy is now underway, everyday message according to the grid pushed out worldwide, specific rebuttal capability in each setup. There are overtones there or undercurrents there of Alistair Campbell in terms of the grid and in terms of rebuttal capability and so on, part of his PR techniques and so on. So you have discussion about the propaganda campaign. Here's another interesting thing, that as you have this development, this evolution of a series of conflicts, regime change operations, you have discussion about the need for international initiatives to try to communicate or show to the world that good can come from 9/11, that led by the US, a better world can be made. And you got talk there of a humanitarian conference and so on, and also various diplomatic strategies, etc. But all part of, in a sense, trying to sugarcoat or trying to mobilize support for the West in a context where regime change operations were being initiated, all part of the propaganda. Now, what's most remarkable about Chilcot in this section 3.1, and I'm hoping I'm communicating it reasonably clearly, that the documents are indicating essentially a series of regime change operations which had to be underpinned by propaganda. What this actually corroborates and supports strongly are the claims made by Wesley Clark in 2006. Now for a long time, myself and other academics who came across Wesley Clark's claims didn't dismiss them, but we took them with a pinch of salt. We thought, he's overclaiming now, or he's exaggerating. Even though he was a retired General Wesley Clark, he was Supreme Allied Commander Supreme Allied Commander in the late 1990s. Even though they were coming from this very credible source, the question marks were raised. But this is what he said in 2006, and broadly speaking, this is corroborated now by the Chilcot report in section 3.1. So I'll just play this for you to listen to.
About 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the Joint Staff who used to work for me, and one of the generals called me in. He said, "Sir, you got to come in. You got to come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, "No." He says, "We've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, "We're going to war with Iraq. Why?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do." So I said, "Well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to Al-Qaeda?" He said, No. He says, "There's nothing new that way. They just made the decision to go to war with Iraq." He said, "I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we've got a good military and we can take down governments." And he said, "I guess if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail." So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, he said, I just got this down from upstairs, meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran."
So there you go. Wesley Clark.
The truth is about the...
Wesley Clark was not really exaggerating to the extent that some of us thought that he was. He was more or less right on the money, and Chilcot corroborates a lot of what he said. I'm going to throw out a nugget, just because this is indicative evidence, but it's something which I want to leave people with before I move to the closing section of this talk. But there's also indications of a kind of a foreknowledge as well of what was going on. And obviously there's a foreknowledge because there's a kind of plan going in place to engage in countries to clear up problems in the international system using the war on terror. But here you have Tony Blair in a document to George Bush talking about here the Middle East peace process, and he actually makes reference to the Middle East is set for catastrophe. And this is immediately after 9/11. This is before all the wars are starting. I think this is just after the bombing in Afghanistan had started, for example. But there's clear awareness that what was going to happen in the Middle East was going to be very, very big and significant. So Blair refers to the Middle East is set for catastrophe. And this actually correlates to an extent with claims made by Sir Richard Dearlove in the last couple of years. Sir Richard Dearlove was head of MI6, and he stated in 2014, and he gives a very clear indication that there was plans prior to 9/11 in relation to something which was about to happen. It's slightly unclear, and that's why I'm being so cautious talking about it. But this is Sir Richard Dearlove himself, and it's very interesting what he has to say, and I will play this clip now.
Allow me to recount 2 anecdotes about Saudi Arabia, and I think this is the country to which we should always look first in trying to interpret the current agonistes of Islam. Shortly after 9/11, I was visiting Riyadh with the Prime Minister, and I remember the then head of the GID literally shouting at me across his office, 9/11 is a mere pinprick on the West. in the medium term, it's nothing more for you than a series of personal tragedies. What these terrorists want is to destroy the House of Saud and to remake the Middle East. The second Saudi incident predates 9/11 and comes from a conversation with Prince Bandar, now, I believe at the moment the titular head of the GID in Saudi Arabia. And that was, the time is not far off, Richard, in the Middle East when it will be literally God help the Shia. More than 1 billion Sunnis have simply had enough of them. And that was a chilling comment, which I remember very well indeed. Now, what we have in these two examples is the clearest evidence
So, another little nugget of information, and it's very, very significant that you have somebody such as Sir Richard Dearlove imparting that information into the public domain about a suggestion of something which might be on the horizon in the Middle East prior to 9/11 and so on. I won't say anything more than that for now, but what it does kind of make sense, and it makes sense obviously with what we see, what Wesley Clark says, and the other documents released from Chilcot in terms of the planning for regime change operations. So what does this all mean? What do we draw from this run-through of documents and the way I've contextualised it in terms of the start of the war on terror, and then with these additional quotes from senior officials? Is what it really tells us at the end of the day, I think, is that the war on terror itself can be understood as a propaganda campaign. That the spectre of Islamic fundamentalist terrorism has been used to mobilise support for regime change wars, and that's very clearly indicated now by Chilcot as well as people such as Wesley Clark. There has been remarkably, if not total, lack of contestation from mainstream media and academia about this issue. Really, people who have raised these kind of questions have been very much at the margins and so on. But that kind of questioning of the war on terror, essentially, as a series of aggressive regime change operations enabled by 9/11, is something which has not been engaged with by anyone. In a sense, the propaganda campaigns of maintaining a particular perception of the war on terror have been very successful. And the war on terror, and this is the implication of what I'm saying, is not really about dealing with a threat out there. It is about exploiting that threat for geopolitical purposes. And so, to reiterate, the war on terror itself can be seen as an act of propaganda, a strategic deception, as Mearsheimer would say, on a vast scale. So, this is where we end up with in terms of the knowledge that we have coming from Chilcot and years of research by a number of academics, but years of material coming out slowly and then coming out through the inquiries. This is where we end up with, or where we end up at in terms of understanding the war on terror. War on terror is not what we thought it was, that it's been underpinned by propaganda, and it's been about regime change operations. It's about being engaging militarily in the international system. It's been about liberal democracies starting wars. And as I said, in terms of talking about the importance of the war on terror, wars which have led to the loss of many, many lives, have profoundly shaped the internal domestic politics of Western countries in terms of civil liberties and so on. So in going full circle, back to the start, when people talk about these characters being a problem in terms of propaganda, okay, and these media outlets being a problem in terms of propaganda, well, I suggest that this is the least of our worries. This is the smallest problem that we have. That when we start to understand the war on terror and the kind of propaganda associated with it and the consequences of that, the propaganda and the problem with propaganda is much more serious in relation to legitimate political actors, ourselves and our own mainstream media and so on. And sort of misdirecting attention onto these actors and so on is taking away from a proper self-awareness of really quite how deceptive and manipulative the information environment is within Western democracies, and how it has, in a very fundamental way, helped to underpin a series of aggressive military actions throughout the international system. That's difficult to absorb for some of you, but that's where I think we are at in terms of our understanding of what's going on. So it means there's a lot of propaganda, and the propaganda problem isn't emanating from the usual suspects. Okay, I'm going to move to close now, maybe just with some ideas. It's one thing documenting and arguing that we live in a highly propagandized society in the West and in liberal democracies, and that this propaganda is being used to enable wars which are fundamentally destructive. All well and good doing that, but what can we do about it? Well, okay, I don't have that much time to talk about this, but what I would say, and I've got 6 points, I think. Don't be distracted by fake news, alternative, media, Russian interference discourse. Okay, I think this is misdirection. It's pulling people's attention away from the problems which are here in our own democracies, in our own political systems, in our own academies, in our own media outlets. Possibly propaganda itself. So don't be distracted by fake news, alternative media, Russian interference discourse. Second, we all need to learn to recognise propaganda in the mainstream media, and I'm currently setting up an organisation for propaganda studies, and one of its remits is to try to enable and to give people the tools and the skills to recognise propaganda. A practical offering here: use multiple media sources. Okay, so this idea that we should not be listening to Russia Today, as is suggested by some Western media outlets, and I'm not naming any names at this point, but use multiple media sources. Okay, all media sources will probably have some kind of information which is useful for you to draw upon in order to understand what's going on in the world. Okay, but we should encourage ourselves and encourage everyone around us to actually draw upon a plurality or a multiplicity of information sources, not just a standard mainstream. Go and look at alternative media, go and look at independent media, watch Russia Today, look at these other channels and so on, and learn to discern what you can take from that as accurate and what you think might be slightly misleading. And then a very important part of this process is to learn to trust in your own judgment. Okay, we have to. And this is really a requirement of a democracy in a way, that people need to have the skills, but also the confidence to actually make judgments on information that they're receiving, and to develop confidence in their own judgment to take a position on an issue. That's how democracy is supposed to work. But it strikes me that in this day and age that there is a loss of confidence in our ability to judge for ourselves what we think is accurate or inaccurate. So some people just proceed through, just I trust the BBC, it's telling me the truth and so on, rather than sort of applying a more critical stance towards that. Trust in our own judgment. There also needs to be more broadly and over time, there needs to be a challenge to the manipulative and deceptive communication strategies, which we know are employed by powerful actors. Okay, all the things I've been talking about today, really. I mean, all of these sort of communication strategies emerge from decisions being made within governments, within organisations, and so on. And all of these things sorry, there's a little interruption there. This requires a serious engagement, really, essentially, with the ethics of communication that we see at this point in time in democracies. Fifth point, critical examination, exposure of attempts to infiltrate media and academia. We do have a problem with the way in which there is a co-optation, to an extent, between aspects of the academy and aspects of the media with propaganda activities, and these really need to be exposed, because they really undermine our ability to work out what's going on in the world. Finally, developing critical thinking and media literacy skills across a population. We need to teach people the skills to discern information which is accurate, inaccurate, and so on, rather than go down the road that we are at the moment of censoring information, this sort of censoring of Facebook, etc. These trying to develop algorithms which will sift out information and so on and get rid of the fake news, etc. That really we need to give people critical thinking skills and not go down the road to censorship. That's a very dangerous path to go down, which unfortunately we do seem to be going down at the moment. So these are some of the things that we need to do, and these are some of the things which the Organisation for Propaganda Studies will extend analysis into and so on over time as the organisation is set up. But these are some of the starting points for how we might start to try to challenge the problem that we have. And just really to conclude the lecture, understanding, and it should be obvious from what I've been talking about for the last hour or so, is understanding propaganda is central to understanding how power is exercised in the international system and into politics in general. Understanding political power, we need to understand propaganda. Okay. Also, and drawing upon what I've talked about in terms of the Chilcot Inquiry and what it tells us about the war on terror, this huge thing which has been shaping our lives for 16 years, this huge thing which has been shaping and underpinning these conflicts which we've been engaged in for so long, is in some ways, I think it is correct to suggest that there is a significant and permanent displacement of reality at this point in time, that the world we actually live in is one that's very different from the world that we think we live in, because of the level of amount of propaganda. And all of this ultimately obviously leads to profound implications for the health of Western democracies. And I'll leave and I'll end the talk on that issue. But this is where, this is not just a matter of studying propaganda or international politics. This really comes down to questions of understanding the state of contemporary democracy, how democratic it is, and so on. So this is an urgent research agenda for today, and which I think needs to be pursued aggressively over time in order to deal with these issues which pertain ultimately to the state of our democracies. Thank you.